to leave part of it in place because, you know, as a parent, one of your worst nightmares is when you see the words, "some assembly required." And then you realize that the amount of assembly required far exceeds what you could possibly imagine. The instructions for assembly are probably only halfway written in English, and there's probably a few steps that got omitted. And you still have to struggle with assembling whatever it is. And so at least by the middle of Christmas morning, in order to keep from traumatizing your children, they want it assembled. Well, I've discovered a number of things are similar to that, including graduation outfits. That there's things in the back, there's things in the, anyway, so it takes a while to assemble these things. So I decided, since I'm marching in both, I will just leave it all intact. And I was also thinking, when we talk about attire, I actually did wear these. One of this is School of Medicine, one of this is School of Religion. 3 years ago, they decided we could wear these on Sunday, but they did not want us to wear them on Sabbath. Why? And the reason was because they were jewelry. So. And we could wear jewelry on Sunday, but not on Sabbath. So the next year, I also came without the medallions, and somebody said, "Where are your medallions?" I said, "I was told we weren't supposed to wear them because they were jewelry." So anyway, they said, "Oh no, that was just last year." So anyway, this year you will notice that I am wearing jewelry, and so that's part of the official attire. Anyway. This is one of those strange lessons I was kind of struggling with. First I was going to do it, then they were saying something else was going to work out, and by the time I was told that I actually was going to do it, I was right in the middle of a final draft on a chapter. I was absolutely overwhelmed. I had, you know, between that and grading papers and all the other exciting things that go with the professorial role, even as of last night when I got home from the hooding, I still didn't know what I was going to do with it. And it wasn't that I hadn't thought about it, but it was the chapters that Dr. Provonsha had written on anxiety, guilt, and then forgiveness. That's the ones, the titles I was given. And actually I like to try to at least find something to do that builds on the actual topics that I'm assigned. So, you know, I was even asking myself psychologically, put yourself on the couch, why are you finding this one so difficult to do? And I figured part of it was just, as I say, been busy. Right up until Friday I was working on a chapter, and then, as I say, school has its own exciting challenges. But I was realizing the challenge was just talking about some of the negative emotions that represents and how dicey it can be dealing with some of those. So anyway, several things I want to point out. Number one, it was just an interesting example of, as is the whole book, about the zeitgeist of the times and how difficult it can be to truly transcend the times in which we live, the times in which we write, the perspectives that go along with that. So I think we find much in Dr. Provonsha's writing that is truly timeless. Things that endure, that stand the test of time, and we say that speaks to me in a very important way even now. And it's also interesting when you read a book like that to understand the fact that there are some perspectives that are shaped by the times in which we live. There are some issues that get addressed, there's some ways we frame them, there's some perspectives we bring to them, and they do change. And so part of the gift of treasuring some of the legacy people around here at Loma is learning how to truly, deeply, positively embrace the timeless truths that they bring, and also to learn how to kind of navigate and filter out, you know, what to do with the things that are more time limited. One of my favorite examples of that, when I was a student at La Sierra University, at that point part of Loma Linda University, I was an example of a marriage that did not survive marital therapy, and they decided to go their separate ways. I don't know the whole story behind that. But at that time, when I was a student, La Sierra was, in fact, a subsidiary of, I mean, it was part of Loma Linda University, which had been a marriage, maybe, as I say, ultimately it did not work out. But we would sometimes get guests from this campus who would speak to us on some topics, and many of them were very, very interesting to me. But when we got somebody from the Loma Linda side of things, on the from the Department of Psychiatry. If we got a Loma Linda psychiatrist, one thing we knew for sure, they were Freudian. At least all the ones that came as guests at La Sierra. And so we learned all about mommies and potties and feces and phalluses and painting feces on the walls, and that was a typical lecture from a Loma Linda psychiatrist. And we learned about all the parental introjects and how the deep Freudian processes were at work, how they shaped the psyche and formed the human personality, and that was just, at least for the ones that lectured to us, that was standard. We got a lot of those lectures over the years. And with my combination of interests in theology and behavioral science, I tried to listen to things on both sides of the spectrum. But now let me ask you this. If you were to hear a Loma Linda psychiatrist today, would they be talking about mommies and potties and feces and Oedipal complexes and loving your, all of, would you be hearing that?
Nope.
No, I haven't heard that for a long time, and I've had some interactions with the Department of Psychiatry here, and one of my star students is actually sticking around and going to be a part of that. No, we don't hear about that at all. What is the predominant perspective that we hear in psychiatry and here at Loma Linda today?
Medication.
Medication, yes. And for me, that's exciting because I'm one of these science nerds. I read, many weeks, a dozen or maybe 24 science research studies, and many of them actually do have to do with pharmaceuticals. And some of them are psychotropic pharmaceuticals, and I'm one of these weird people that really has fun staying on top of the very latest research and how even things like various drugs have been considered street drugs, exactly what the trajectory is toward they're being considered as serious medications. And so sometimes it's fun when I'm talking to some of the medical students or so forth. They say, wow, I didn't realize a religion professor liked, to study that stuff. But that is front and center now. And it just wants to show you how things do change and perspectives change. So as you read through the work of Dr. Provonsha, I'm struck by the timeless wisdom, and it's also fun to just pay a little attention to some of the things that are time-bound, to the circumstances. When he talks about anxiety, for example, there's quite a bit that, some of the analogies he uses, the stories he uses about parental shaping, use some fairly psychodynamic terminology that probably would not be totally in vogue today. All the things that happen. We do know that certainly there are factors in our childhood that can be significant in creating a great deal of anxiety in adulthood. But we also, as somebody said, follow the heredity, the research on DNA, on heredity, on genetics, on epigenetics, things like jumping genes. People say, why aren't identical twins always identical? They're more similar, but they're not identical. Was because of choices they made or their parents raised them in different ways. Well, actually, there's some very complex epigenetic factors that work into that are probably not related to parenting or even choices they made. It's complicated. But we now know that far more of our behavior is wired in than what we used to believe. And that certainly has a lot to do with things like anxiety and depression. That there's a very, very strong heritable, which is not the same as inherited. There's a little bit of difference there. They tend to go together, but they're not identical. But traits like, which Dr. Provonsha talks about in the first of the 2 chapters that Dr. Larson gave me, and anxiety, there is definitely a very strong hereditary component to that. The same is true with depression, that if you have one parent who's depressed versus you have 2 parents who's depressed, there is an enormously significant wired-in factor that goes into that. That does not mean that there aren't things that people can do to change that. I think there are things that can be helpful, but I think it's helpful at least to recognize that some of the psychodynamic things, well, it was all this way because you had a, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's statement about a schizophrenic mother. Wouldn't you like to be called that? a schizophrenic mother was one who caused her offspring to be schizophrenic. And they had all these theories on exactly how a schizophrenic mother worked, and they say most of them have been completely disproven at this point. It's not how schizophrenia develops. It's completely, as I say, it's not what much anybody believes anymore. But at one point we did. And I'm not saying that parenting can't make a difference. I'm not saying that context, circumstances don't make a difference, but I do want to point out that it's much better to learn to work within the parameters what people are born with than to attribute it all to things that they can change. Even this morning when I was listening to Habit, an excellent sermon, by the way. So those of you who didn't hear it first time, it'll be available again. So, and yet, even with Habit, there's a very strong component that is not just something you woke up one morning and decided, I'm going to be this way, or I'm going to be that way, or I'm going to do something else. It's not that simple. For example, smoking. I always learned to realize, I always grew up with the idea, there are bad people and they like cigarettes. And there are good people who know that Jesus doesn't love cigarettes. And same with alcohol and so forth. And but here's an interesting thing. We know with nicotine, one of the significant factors that leads to a nicotine craving is a inherited or built-in, wired-in deficit in the dopamine D2 receptor. And the dopamine D2 receptor has something to do with how we process and how we experience pleasure. It also can impact some things like anxiety. It was particularly significant in terms of how we process what makes life satisfying, enjoyable, that type of thing. Many people have experienced a deficit there before they ever started their first cigarette. Once they get that hit of nicotine, people will sometimes have the feeling, wow, I finally feel normal for the first time. I finally know what life feels like for everybody else, because finally my neuroreceptors are being regulated in a way that they were not before. Now, I'm not trying to say that nicotine is the best or even a good solution to it, but I'm just saying if you don't recognize that, if you simply frame that in terms of good people and bad people and that type of thing, you're not getting at some deep and powerful forces at work. And I was always wired as the good kid. I'm one of 4 boys. My mother was very, very deeply invested in the process of making sure that no known sin ever crossed the threshold of our home. So we didn't have TV, we didn't have comics even, which my parents decided were wrong. We could not listen to jazzy music. If you were in church today, I bet you actually heard some jazzy music, right? So anyway, I wasn't even quite sure what jazzy music was, but I was asking one of my friends, I said, what's jazzy music anyway? I know we're not supposed to listen to it. And he said, well, I think it's You Are My Sunshine. And so I was on a Pathfinder outing, and some of the Pathfinders started singing You Are My Sunshine. And I was aghast. Here I am in the back of a camper with Pathfinders, and jazzy music is happening right here in my very midst. Anyway, so I was a good kid. I tried to internalize all the things I was and wasn't supposed to do. But I realized some of that was just wired in. Because I'm one of 4 boys, I can assure you that some of the sin that wasn't supposed to creep in, crept in. So I don't know how it happened. But, even the guards at the door and everything were not sufficient. But it was reminding me that a lot of who we are is kind of wired in. And, you hear even things about birth order, which have something to do with personality. But, you hear this thing, well, the firstborn is supposed to be the good, totally responsible one. My older brother said, not on my job description. I think he's made up for it in some ways, but at least at that point. So it all fell on me. I was the one who had to look good in my parents' Christmas letter. And so, my mom would come in and she'd read the Christmas letters about all her friends who's had child prodigy kids and everything. And there's this kind of expectant, And I remember once I said, Mom, you can stop, I hate him already. But there is so much that is wired in, even about anxiety. And it's not only wired in how much you're prone to anxiety, but even how you deal with anxiety. And I know I'm more prone than average to anxiety. You know, it's something that's more of a struggle than it is for the average. I'm not way up there at the top, but I am definitely more than the midpoint. But for me, when I deal with anxiety, you know, the best thing that works for me is things that ramp things down, what I call Zen zone. So in our backyard, I actually have my little tropical paradise corner of the yard, which I've tried to, you know, plant with various tropical plants and everything, and you know, I've got sauna, you know, all the kind of things that are just completely unwinding. That's what works for me. My wife, I would say also, like me, probably a little more prone to anxiety than usual, than the average. For her, what works best is to ramp everything up and make sure everybody's taking things really seriously. And if I look calm in an anxious situation, she thinks I'm not taking it seriously. And she's looking at me, what's wrong with you? Why are you? But there are some people for whom relaxation makes them more anxious. And that's wired in too. So you'll often get people, one is saying, let's calm it down, let's calm it down. The other person says, the only way I feel good is if we ramp things up. And that can create some relationship excitement. But once again, that's the kind of thing that is, there's a heavy wired in component. And things we grow up with, you know, our environments, or, you know, those type of things do play a role, but they're not totally determinative. There's a lot that goes into just how we're wired. So I guess my first basic point is it makes a lot of sense to learn how we're wired and to respect it. You know, for a long time, behaviorists had this idea that you could just simply write over anything. That if you get, you know, that genes might be peripheral, but M&Ms are eternal. You know, just give people enough M&Ms, and eventually you have a habit that lasts forever. Not that simple. Even with Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov's dogs, remember, they learned to salivate to the sound of what? Yeah. They would not learn that. They could not learn it for a light. So it's a relatively small range of things, even for Pavlov's dogs, that they could respond to. Now, I have a cartoon I showed to some of my students called Pavlov's cat. And Pavlov is trying to get several frames of the cat. One, the cat is just walking out of the room. The other cat is, you know, rolling over, just, you know, pat my tummy, and there's Pavlov with his bell. You know, basically Pavlov's cat doesn't work. Okay, basic thing is that respect what's wired in. And actually, sometimes the people just talk and then put questions at the end. Any questions on that part? Just, you know, heredity, genetics, epigenetics, wired in, respecting what's wired in. Is that any comments, questions on that part? Yes. I don't know if you want to.
Calvin, could you briefly sketch Provonsha's take on that, and then how you feel that you agree with, adjustment perhaps needs to be made with that today?
Well, I think that he writes, number one, very, very thoughtfully, very sensitively on both anxiety and guilt, and I'm going to come back to forgiveness, say a little bit if we have time to say more about that. But one of the things, particularly in the his section on guilt was actually was much shorter. It's actually a whole chapter on anxiety. But the language he uses tends to be fairly Freudian, psychodynamic, and for the average reader you might not recognize it, but if, you know, those of us who are steeped in the behavioral science literature, you know, the language about, you know, how we repress different things of our parents and so forth, it's just at least somewhat more Freudian. I don't think he would deny the biological part. I just would say that since that was still a day when psychological issues were attributed much more to very complex parenting factors than the current research suggests. So that's the main difference, I would say. That, I mean, so many things. They used to teach, when I first started looking at family therapy, we talked about the fact that schizophrenia was formed by not just the schizophrenic mother, But there was a whole sequence that was designed about, when the child, mother says, oh, come here and give me a hug. Child comes forth, mom comes back. And they had this whole sequence outlined about, all the different things that happened that created a schizophrenic kid. And I'm just saying that that is not now the current thinking. And much of what was said is absolute gospel truth in that era is not the current thinking. So I would say, I don't think Dr. Provonsha was just saturated with that, but I'm just saying I recognize the language. I'm just saying that the current thinking would have a lot more of a role for genetics, epigenetics, wired-in factors that parenting can impact, but only within a small range. In other words, you've got to work within the range you've got available to you. And that's true in all kinds of things, like, even with weight. Weight is largely inherited. If you try too hard to fool your body will fight back, and it will get its revenge. Now, for me, inheritance is that I could always play hide and go seek by standing sideways as a kid. I always got the jokes about, do you have to wear water skis in the shower to keep from going down the drain? And if you saw my son in particular, but actually both my kids, but it's particularly true with my son, if you saw the two of us together, you would see there's a lot of genetics at work. And I remember I met one of his landlords once. And the landlord's kind of looking at him, looking at me, looking at him, looking at me, and said, guess you don't get any milkman jokes around your family. It does not mean that you can't change anything, but you have to respect a certain range. And that's what was missing in a lot of the literature, and even current stuff on habits. It's just anybody can change to do anything. You've got to know what the range is. You've got to work within that range. You've got to respect it, because if you don't, you will frustrate yourself, probably drive everybody else around you nuts, and you won't achieve, using weight as an example, people who can't work within the basic parameters and try too hard through crash dieting and so forth, the body extracts its revenge. And you ultimately, the last state is worse than the first. So you can move it down, you can get more exercise, you can eat healthy, and in some of my classes we will even talk about some of those. But you got to respect the range. So hope that helps. Okay, over here, yeah.
Two comments, I'm not sure you can answer them, but it seems to me that when I was starting medical school, anxiety was barely mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a dominant finding. And the other thing is to what extent do you think that anxiety is a Western cultural phenomenon? And that somehow it's related to culture in the sense that I don't think it has quite the prominence in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question, because that's another thing that is often overlooked, is the role of culture in a variety of different phenomena. In other words, it may be less about parenting, but the part that is part of what we call the non-shared environment that actually starts becoming a part of your wiring over time is probably culture shapes that more than parenting. And I can give you a variety of examples of that people caught eating disorders from us. In other words, that was a Western phenomenon that actually became culturally transmitted as Western media began to impact other parts of the world. And so there were some kind of slightly similar things in some other cultures, but the phenomenon of eating disorders, as we experience it in the West, we can track it as it became culturally contagious, as people caught it from us. Another example of culture, even talking about things like anxiety, depression, mood disorders. Suicide is quite common actually very common in Japan. But the American pharmaceutical companies decided that was a bonanza field day, so they began to try to first market the antidepressants that were used here in the United States as a solution to the problem of suicide in Japan. And it didn't work, because there's a whole different cultural context for it. And there's even, you go on websites, find out what train goes a certain speed, something like that. So I would just say that culture is actually, I mean, our wiring develops within the context of culture. Now, I'm not saying wiring can't be changed. One thing that Pastor Randy brought up today is the impact of social media, internet, technology on our brains. That's an example where I would just say the current research, it's not all in yet. And there's a lot that's being still developed on there that we're still, and some of it is mixed, but I would just say one way or another, we do know that your wiring is impacted strongly by electronics. Because the human brain was never designed for electronics. You know, in fact, even our biorhythms, our body rhythms, are very much attuned to the cycles of, you know, the sunset, sunrise, and in most cultures where they have not had much light at all after dark, people just went to bed after dark, you know, and so that was, you know, so even just the phenomenon of natural light, of the wavelength of natural light, you know, all kinds of things about our electronic devices, those are rewiring our brain. So culture is significant. I can give you a bunch of other examples, but as I say, the American pharmaceutical companies try to exploit an issue for their own profit. And it was tragic, I would just say, because they were not taking account a cultural context. Anyway, I think another comment or, back here.
Freud and Bowen's emotional system they put great emphasis on the mother as the cause of their children's illnesses, mental illnesses. I understand that because the mother was the one who spent the most time with the children at the time. But there's a shift happening. Now many male men are raising children and spending a lot of time with them. Are we gonna see a time where male are gonna be blamed for the way the children are?
Actually, there's some,
Yes.
actually a lot of that's already happening. You know, dads are being blamed as well. Although here's an interesting thing, is that if a father is really involved with his kids, he always gets credited very highly. You know, I mean, wow, isn't this amazing? You know, it's not taken for granted. I mean, he gets stars in his crown, I'm sure. So, you know, that when fathers are involved in their kids, and it's interesting just the language. You know, mom, what is mom supposed to do? Maybe she's getting too involved with their kids, and dad's involved with his kids. Oh, isn't this wonderful? Everything. So dads are they're factoring into even research and the equations. They're just not getting blamed as much. But the overall context, even with Bowen, which I've been a huge fan of Bowen for many, many years, and I'm less Bowenian than I used to be by quite a bit. And that's been a tough one. That was like losing my religion to lose faith in Murray Bowen. But I still find ways to, some of that is still operative. But a lot of what Bowen, about the non-anxious presence, Bowen didn't say a word about genetics in that, or a lot of the things about wiring, and it was all about family context and so forth. And that makes a difference. But we often behave like our families because, in part, we're genetically like our families. And I actually tell people, when I used to do the preparation for marriage class here on campus, I used to talk to the couples. I said, it's a warning sign if you don't like your partner's parents. I said, it's not fatal. The relationships can sometimes work anyway, but at least pay attention to it. Because whether we like it or not, most of us over time become more like our parents. And so, scary, scary thought, you're at this, what was it Randy called the rainy season today. When we get married, we're all, I'm going to be nothing like my parents, whatever, that's all, everyone's saying that, And over time, there's this gravitational pull, and by, 10 years, 20 years of the marriage, oh, you're just like your mother, whatever. And we say we pick, we project, we provoke. We pick somebody like our mother or father, we project onto them, you're just like that, we provoke them, we needle them until they start acting that way. But it's also just an inevitable kind of gravitational, even genetic pull. We become more like our parents over time in general. There are some people who are able to kind of resist that and maintain themselves through it. And that's where Bowen can be helpful. But that's the natural progression. Speaking of that, I remember the mother who, telling our kids, take it seriously. A mother, one of the dental students called me and said, can you break up my son and his fiance? And so I had to say, I don't think we do that. That's not what we do around here. But I said, actually, very compatible couple. I said the problem is not the couple, but that's a tough one. So it's going to be difficult long term. I don't know what's happened since. But let's see. Question, comment back there.
Yeah, I don't know if this is relevant to your topic, but could you comment on something a little bit more theological, such as the new birth that the Bible talks about? What are the psycho-neurodynamics of the new birth? How new is new in view of what you've said?
Yeah, that's when it says, "Behold, I create all things new." Let me just give you an illustration. I don't know if this will help or not, but I have worked some with something called spiritual gifts, and there are several ways to understand it. There's different spiritual gifts inventories, and even theologically, what is a spiritual gift? Sometimes in the Bible, it's something that the way God equips us under specific times and circumstances to respond creatively and in a way that is a witness to the Lord in a specific circumstance. It's not something you are. Like, we've turned it into something kind of similar to everything from astrological signs to Myers-Briggs to colors. My mom was into colors. She could look at you and tell you immediately what season you are. But anybody, is that familiar to anybody? That's how you look, and what clothes you should wear. So she was ready to throw out all my shirts because they were the wrong season. But we've kind of turned spiritual gifts into something like that, something that you are. But one of the other things I saw in some of those spiritual gifts inventories is the idea that your natural talents are given to you at birth, your spiritual gifts are given to you at baptism, conversion, somewhere in that kind of thing. And the idea was that they're kind of very disconnected, that God, something kind of rains on you, and you wake up one morning, whoa, who am I? Who is this? It's like the kids whose mother was giving herself a face, a mud pack and a permanent and everything, and her kids were getting really noisy, and she ran in and said, "You guys shut up immediately!" And after she got up in the room, she heard one of her kids say, "Who was that?" So, anyway, the idea was sometimes that, at conversion, God makes us into somebody new. And really quite temperamentally different from who we are. I have come to the conviction that what God does in recreation is very much something that respects the basic personality stuff that's kind of wired in. And people who try to go too much against that by saying, I'm converted now. Now I'm a whole new person, and aren't looking at that continuity. I see a lot of catastrophic damage that happens in terms of that. I mean, just one of many examples. Somebody said, the Lord has completely delivered me from my addiction. And I'm not saying that there aren't times when somebody doesn't have a very sudden, dramatic sense of, something, but most of the time, whatever it is, say a lot of it's not just habit, but wiring. If people aren't dealing with wiring, then, they have this, it's kind of a binge purge thing. It's like when I was at Academy, we had these record burning things. We were supposed to burn all our rock music records. And so you have, I'm going to purge myself, get rid of all these. Well, whatever it is we purge, they kind of come back, and people then they binge, and they purge, and they binge, and they purge. If you're not dealing with the longer term stuff in terms of conversion, and I think the Lord is part of that, but if you're not dealing with that, and you just say, the Lord has given me a whole new personality, or a new this, or a new that, I've just seen a lot of catastrophic results. And one of the ways I've also seen it, even in terms of the call to the ministry. Most of my career, my driving passion is I was going to be a pastor who taught pastors. And it was kind of, I was getting all this healthcare and both healthcare policy, biomedical science stuff, chaplaincy on the side, but I never thought that's what I would end up doing. I would end up working in a healthcare context. My plan was to be a pastor who taught pastors. And so much of my career, that's what I was doing, and I saw people who had gotten, quotes, a call to the ministry, who had had a conversion experience, and they believed that God was doing something totally new and radical in their life, and they weren't dealing with the whole history and the context and the realities of who they were as a person, and you just watch some of those students come unraveled through the process of studying to become pastors. And so it is not that I don't believe that God converts people and God transforms people and God helps people become new people, but my own conviction is that what God does with us that's new, number one, it respects the person he created us to begin with. And the second thing is that it tends not to be just an instant 30 seconds in the microwave and then suddenly, you know, boom, there it is, it's all happened. God works with us over time, gradually begins to infiltrate in different ways, and there are resources that really can help. You know, there are spiritual practices we know actually change the brain. If you regularly spend time thinking about, contemplating the love and the grace of God, in less than 3 months, we can actually see brain changes in the anterior cingulate, which has to do with compassion and love. We also know that if you contemplate, you think about God as a cruel and vindictive God, over time, thinking that way actually does brain damage. But what that suggests to me is that there are ways that over time God changes us. And it has, you know, I think it actually means that even the things we do spiritually, they're things that, as I say, they kind of seep in, they begin to saturate who we are, but it's a gradual process, a gradual transformative process. And the other thing I would say is there are setbacks. You know, there are, and that's not just because, you know, you were a bad person or something, but setbacks are, I just having finished this big chapter on neuroscience and free will, one of my conclusions was our free will range is very limited. And in a lot of ways we know that, even like if somebody tries to argue with your politics, your brain will reject it as a pathogen. We can watch it, we can fMRI scan you, we can watch your brain. So that's why all of your Facebook posts convert your friends to your political views, right? Okay, another question, comment, okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Calvin. I have a question about a word that you use, respect, right? You said several times respect, how you are wired in. So I want you to explain what you mean by this. I'll ask you why. Okay. I like to steal, okay? Or I like to lie. I mean, there was recently news about this Hollywood star. I mean, there's a good Adventist, I don't remember the name. But she has millions of dollars, right? But she likes to steal. I mean, she just says, I enjoy that, just to be able to go in and get out without being caught. So, do you mean like be aware of? Or what do you mean by respect? Because
I would want to know, I mean,
how do you
the
respect?
classic language I grew up with was all about sin and righteousness. Now, I'm not saying that those aren't helpful categories, but I'm saying I become more nuanced in how I understand those. Let's say, I talking about being the good kid. I remember when I was in second grade, I got to play the bad voice, the little school play with one kid being the good voice, and other kid got, and that was my one, you know. My other big rebellion, in addition to playing the bad voice in second grade, is I grew tall. My dad said I would never grow tall. And so he was always trying to prepare me to be short. So I just grew tall as my big act of rebellion. But somebody who is inclined toward what we might call kleptomania. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have moral responsibility, but my viewpoint would say that there's probably more, there are some things going on. For example, some people get a spike of, dopamine spike out of doing that stuff, and if you're not recognizing even some of the biochemical stuff going on, you might be missing what it would require to help that person make the changes. Now, let me give you another example of that: abusive relationships. You've all known somebody who is dating or even married to somebody who's really abusive, and your message to them is always, why don't you just dump the turkey? Thanksgiving is coming. No, but why don't you just dump the turkey? And they never could quite do it. And you say, look what this relationship is doing to you. And it's terrible what it's doing to them. I mean, don't you think about all these nice guys that you could be? But invariably, you ask the person, why aren't you dating somebody like, so and so, or somebody, somebody that would treat you well? And the inevitable argument is, oh, they're so, what? Boring, absolutely. Yeah, so if you don't take into account the chemistry, why people get addicted to abusive relationships, there is a chemistry to it. There's a wiring factor. If you're not dealing with that, no matter how much you just say, Jesus doesn't want you to be in an abusive relationship, you go right back to it. So what I'm saying by respecting it is that there are complex reasons why a lot of things happen. I'm not saying it to try to, justify or saying people have no excuse, but I mean, let me give you another example. In the movie Fireproof, have you seen that?
No.
Okay, it's a good Christian movie, by the way. I mean, it's actually a religious movie on marriage. So your guardian angel will go see it with you, and actually approve and clap. No. So, by the way, when I was growing up, only guardian angels got a dispensation to see The Sound of Music, but they're a little more flexible with guardian angels now. But let's see, I lost.
Fireproof.
What's that?
Fireproof.
Yeah, Fireproof. The guy has a problem with Miss Pixel. Do you know who Miss Pixel is? Porn.
She made pixels.
Now, I always tell the women, I said, now you're not off the hook either, because there's Miss Pixel and there's also Mr. Cass. Mr. Cass can't afford a shirt. Remember in all the romance novels, these poor guys, they're all rich, but they can't afford shirts. But anyway, I'm not really talking about fantasy, but the guy, he ends up smashing his computer because that's the way he can stop looking at Miss Pixel. Now, maybe in the context of things, that may be the best way at that time, but the fact is, a lot of times people go online looking at stuff because what they're really trying to do is self-medicate for mood disorders. Depression, anxiety, attention, there's a whole variety of different mood disorders. Now, I'm not in any way justifying what happens. In fact, we do know that over time, the exposure to some of those things online begins to actually further deaden the dopamine receptors in the brain. And there are consequences. It's not, there are some real things. But here's the question. If you just frame it in terms of sin and righteousness, that's a bad thing. God doesn't want you to do that. And you're not looking at the whole context, you're missing some stuff, because it could be very likely that that's something a person is doing in order to self-medicate because of mood disorders. And so my premise is that you've got to deal with all that stuff. You've got to look at all those things, and that's what I mean by respecting. It doesn't mean justifying it, but it means looking at the whole picture. Even with using temptation, we all tell the story of David and Bathsheba. And it's all this hot, young, lusty, hormonal David with the head of Goliath in one hand as he's looking out, That's not the Bible story. The Bible story is of middle-aged, grieving, out of shape David, who is suffering from a lot of family problems. He's probably really worried about his physical condition, maybe his virility, because this is closer to Abishag than Goliath. And you remember what happened with Abishag before the blue pills had been invented. We know David was out of shape because the only other time he goes out to battle, they have to carry him home because he's so out of shape. And this is the first time the Bible describes him staying home. And no matter how dicey it got out there, stealing Saul's canteen or cutting off his coat when Saul was going to the bathroom, whatever, all this stuff, David was this band of brothers. And David is now alone. He's lost his social support system. So I'm saying the standard temptation just has this, how to overcome the demon of lust. And as I say, here's young, hot, hormonal David. And the reality is, here's David. He's insecure. He's declining in physical condition. We don't know how close he is to the Abishag state of life. He's alone. His social support is gone. His family is a mess. Maybe it's just as important to deal with all that stuff as it is to deal with the hot temptation kind of thing. Yeah. Over here.
Talking about depression, I think that it will help a little bit our discussion if we put it in the context of psychosomatic medicine. which is a strong connection between mind and body. Well, you're talking about genetics and hereditary strong influence on depression and other things. And I was thinking that how the modern science is defining men. Really is defining as a sum of physiochemical processes. And it's pure matter, there is nothing spiritual to it. And if this is the case, then this has a strong influence on our decisions, on the free will, because everything is determined by causes. And I was wondering, you're talking about hereditary and genetics, if there is something more to it than just these hereditary factors.
Oh, absolutely, and everything I've been saying, I hope you get the point. I'm just saying, we're not just succumbing to those things. That's actually something in this chapter I was writing that I was very much saying that our freedom is limited, but neuroscience is working within the premise that let's find what we can do within those parameters, and there are things we can do that can make changes. Like with depression, for example. I do believe that there's a strong hereditary factor that in many cases predisposes some people to more depression than others. But there's a book by a man named Jonathan Hari, and I'm trying to remember the name of the, I'm having a senior moment here, which I'm getting more of all the time, on depression and context things that he believes are significant and can be very, very helpful in actually helping people treat depression. Things like social networks, and I'm not talking about social media, I'm talking about the actual real live people. You know, community, even pets. Pets can be good antidepressants. There's a lot of things that are natural. And there are some things that do, I mean, even what we might call the psychosomatic or placebo effect can be real. In other words, what it does show is that there are times when the way we see ourselves and the framework we adopt can make a difference in how we experience something. By the way, one of the problems is placebo is getting stronger. It's harder to do research. I see Tony nodding his head. A lot of the research studies are getting more difficult now because the placebo effect is getting stronger. And so it's harder to study the treatment effect in today's, and a lot of the scientific experiments that are going on, because when you give somebody a placebo, that people are responding really powerfully to, but more so to the point is more likely to confound researchers. And my joke is, yep, those cartels that mix up the placebo, they're putting a lot of other stuff in it now. And the placebo you can buy out on the street now is a lot stronger than the kind you used to be able to get. But one of the things about that is just the fact that it does say that there are some aspects of human nature and behavior that are not directly chemical. And one of the things I'm working with some students on right now is we're trying to understand some of the new medications that apparently are, you know, E-ketamine has just been approved, but there's some others in the pipeline that, one of the fascinating things, we're working on psilocybin. One of the students started, and now I'm working with a couple other students to really carry that research forward. Psilocybin is interesting because unlike standard antidepressants, or it's often used, I mean, we're exploring it for pain, for stuff like that, I mean, several other, is that some of these medications apparently impact the brain long after they're out of the system. The current standards, you know, 2 standard categories we often look at now, but there's a whole third category that's just now being, you know, coming into the pipeline, which may actually change on the basis of changing memories. Anyway, we're still trying to figure out some things on the mechanisms of that stuff. But it suggests the fact that it isn't just chemicals that change the brain. There are experiences, there are memories, there are positive things that can happen to you that will last long after the event itself, that can over time begin to rewire the brain. So I'm not a fatalist, and that's one of the things that, even this chapter I was talking about, I'm not a fatalist. I do believe that God can help change, and circumstances, the experiences we subject ourselves to. Let's see, time-wise, yeah, one more, and then we got to wind up, and I got to get back to marching. Yeah.
My issue has to do with how free is free will, and I agree with virtually everything that you've said today, but there's deep theological implications in terms of my reflection as an Adventist. When I was brought up as a youth, every good promise was to the overcomer. I clearly understood I had to overcome every natural proclivity that was hardwired into me, and those things weren't even mentioned in those days. I spent much of my life in neuroscience, so the idea of perfectionism, of being overcoming, became an impossibility to me that I walked away with.
Yeah.
And so as I re-journey back into virtually everything that you've said here to me is compatible with righteousness by faith. We're saved by grace. But if we have to overcome these fierce, hardwired, primitive, reflexive behaviors that are in our system, and our mission is to overcome them all, then God help us.
Yeah. Well, I'll close with that illustration I use, because I take physicians from China, a friend of mine, I take them on tours of the great scenic American Southwest. And we do about 5 trips a year and so forth. And we always, on the Southwest ones, we go to the Grand Canyon. And we always go to the South Rim of the Grand Canyon. We occasionally go to the North Rim. But not usually. But now I'm supposing I'm on the South Rim, and I'll show my students a picture taken from the South Rim. And say, here I'm on the South Rim of the Grand Canyon. And my destination and my goal is over there. I said, this trip, our goal is to get over into the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. I said, obviously, the best way to do it is to walk in a straight line, right? Right? Well, what's wrong with that? Obviously not. There's a book that they update every 10 years called Over the Edge. And Over the Edge tells the story of everybody who's fallen off Grand Canyon, and every 10 years they update it. So if you want to be a celebrity, we tell guests from overseas, that in America, celebrity is a big deal. So, but we say, don't do it that way. Don't try to get in that book. But straight line is a path to disaster. So what I tell people is figure out what is the next step. Just one step. And it might be this way, it might be that way, it might not at all be, it might be, okay, this is not where I ultimately want to end up, it's the next step I can take right now, by God's grace. And perfectionism, the big problem with it is that it tends to completely overlook the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that, and a lot of detours. I mean, the path from South Rim to North Rim is not direct. But the goal is not to say, I'm just going to march resolutely toward the North Rim. The goal is to figure out what is the next step. And that's where I believe is one of many places that God's grace can interface with our lives to help us figure out what next. Okay, time is up. I got to go march again. I said this will be the second. By the time I march 7 times, something's supposed to fall down. I'm not sure what. But anyway.
Okay, let's do the benediction before Calvin leaves us. Thank you, Calvin, for coming in the midst of this very busy day.
The Lord bless you and keep you.
The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Some assembly required, or just assembly.